legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and the subject today is COVID-19, the death of tourism? ? Now, as we sit here in the first day of March 2022, March 2020, when the pandemic was just beginning to kick into high gear, or certainly the pandemic response, those days may seem a long way away. And we're currently seeing in many parts of the world the COVID restrictions in procession, and certainly the media coverage of it all having dropped off a cliff, and no talk about surging cases anymore or overwhelmed hospitals. All the attention is on the tension between Russia and Ukraine. However, there's still a story to tell here, I feel, and I've been thinking about recording something on this subject for the best part of 2 years, because as soon as all the travel bans came into place back in 2020, globally to a greater or lesser extent, they affected everybody and every location. I began to think about the effect on the tourism industry, which is a huge generator of revenue for many countries around the world, and many companies as well, those airlines, not least of which is a huge industry. And at some point, it was probably about a year into it all, so let's say for the sake of argument, around about March 2021, I was reading articles of the $1 trillion+ losses of the global tourism industry due to the pandemic restrictions. Now, whether it was $1 trillion, £1 trillion, €1 trillion, I can't quite remember, but it doesn't really matter. The losses were vast and potentially catastrophic. And but I kept putting off addressing the issue because the longer I did, the more I wanted to kind of wait and see how things were going to happen. And of course, as I mentioned, we're seeing a relaxing of restrictions in some places. For example, here in England, not exactly across all of the UK, but pandemic restrictions have all been rescinded. Of course, people's behaviour is still being affected, but officially all the restrictions are gone. Now, that doesn't say, of course, that all travel restrictions internationally have gone. They haven't. And we've seen, certainly, as soon as there were several points during the pandemic restrictions, this again will apply to many countries around the world, and it certainly applied here in the UK, when there was a bit of easing and when so-called lockdowns temporarily ended, people travelled where they could. And that usually meant locally or possibly nationally, certainly not internationally. And that increase in so-called staycations, vacationing within your own region or country, those increases have been maintained. People have jumped at the chance to engage in international travel as they've been able to over the last few months. But that domestic tourism sort of uptick that we saw during the lockdown easing looks set to continue for the foreseeable future. So that's a bonus for local tourism, depending where you are in the world. One thing that we noticed at the height of the travel restrictions, quite controversially, was of course that there were exceptions. And we all know about this. Some of these were for sporting events, and sports people and other members of the elite echelons were given exemptions and they were able to travel. And that was just one of the many things that indicated that the pandemic threat was not exactly what it was made out to be. Because if it was that potentially lethal to allow people to travel internationally, well, it just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. If the threat was, as it was stated in many cases, it would be impossible to allow that to happen. So it clearly showed that if we can make exceptions for certain numbers of people, it means it can't be the black and white literal life or death issue that it's being portrayed as. And that's a theme that has continued throughout as restrictions have waxed and waned. And it's a theme that will continue on into the future in various ways, as I'll mention. The issues that we saw that particularly affected travel, first of all, you had issues of quarantines and outright travel bans, which just flat out very clearly prevented international travel. So quarantines meaning that you couldn't leave your location, your country, or travel bans meaning that you just couldn't travel to another country. So even if your own country said you could leave country A, B, or C, say you cannot come here. So those were, there was virtually no way around those unless you were a member of the aforementioned elite echelons. And we saw, obviously, a lot of this was based on vaccine discrimination. So even when things began to loosen up, it was like, if you're vaccinated, you can go, and if you're not, you can't. And this was one of the big levers used to apply pressure on people to get vaccinated so that they could travel. And indeed, many people demonstrated themselves very, very willing at the drop of a hat, if they weren't already vaccinated, to get vaccinated and get boosted however many times. It really didn't matter what they were being asked to do. They would submit to it as long as they could travel. As long as they get their 2 weeks in the sun, drinking warm beer and lying on the beach, then that's all that really mattered. People were so desperate to get back to their perceived normality that they would do almost anything, jump through almost any hoops. Again, that's something that I feel, this is why I waited, something I feel that was a phenomenon during the height of the travel restrictions, and that may not be the last that we hear of it. We then, of course, had the issue of testing. So if you've got a negative test, you can travel, again, under certain circumstances and to certain places. But again, the emphasis was on getting vaccinated, and we saw this by them testing being made increasingly difficult and more expensive. So for a lot of people, it's a case of, well, I'll just get vaccinated, because really just testing is just, the goalposts keep moving, and we have sudden rule changes with regards to what you need to do. And this is another theme that I'll pick up again in a few minutes, because these complex, confusing, and contradictory rules regarding testing, but other travel hoops that needed to be jumped through, were a major problem. You had this ebbing and flowing situation that very difficult to plan around, and that's something, again, I don't think we have heard the last of. Another issue was that when in places where travel did become possible again, from certain places to certain places via certain travel routes, flights, ships, planes, trains, automobiles, whatever it happened to be, it cost more. Companies felt that, I'm guessing they felt they needed to claw back some of their losses by charging more, but also there was definitely profiteering going on. Certain travel providers feeling that they could ask more or less anything and people would pay it, because again, they were so desperate to travel. But of course that excludes the people who don't have the means to pay for that. That plays into the question of elites traveling, and plays into another theme running all throughout this. Another reason I waited before recording this, and a theme that we haven't heard the last of. One of the, and this is something we're still living with now, no matter how relaxed or the things get around travel again. I think relaxed is the wrong word to use. I think just these sort of rules being rescinded. But to use the word relaxed kind of betrays where I'm going next with this. One of the things that people who travel a lot most enjoy, yes, there's that planning, the anticipation of making a trip and going on holiday or some kind of adventure. I'm not talking now again about your 2 weeks lying on the beach, because that doesn't require much planning and there's not that much to get excited about because you know exactly how it's going to go. But is spontaneity, and that is something that we've been robbed of in for those of us who like to travel. The ability to just decide to do something at the drop of a hat, or the ability to go somewhere and maybe without knowing how long you're going to stay or whether you'll go on somewhere else. This is something that lots of younger people do. You know, the gap year, globe trotting and backpacking. That's something that is going to, I think, remain difficult for the foreseeable future. Because if rules can change and goalposts can be moved almost arbitrarily at the drop of a hat, and given that different rules can apply in all different areas of the world, how on earth can you plan a year's trip? You know, I have friends, people I'm thinking of in particular, who've done this in the past, and you know, that's been the trip of a lifetime for them. And I'm thinking, how could they ever do that again? How could you ever say, you know, I'm going this May, and the first place I'm going to go is, you know, wherever it happens to be, Australia, and then I'm doing this and I'm doing that and doing that, and I'll probably be back in May the following year, and I'm going to, you know, I'll circle the world, and who knows what's going to happen, and I'll take jobs here and there. I mean, it's fine if you're up to a point, if you can be reactive, and have very little actual plans in place, just an idea of what you want to do. But if you actually want to have some kind of structure and say, you know, I want to be in this place at this time, if it involves putting any money down, and quite often you want to, if you're doing that sort of thing, you want to you know, secure travel at a particular rate to know at least to some extent what you're paying for, then that planning like that becomes next to impossible. Because if you then say, okay, I'm not going to buy a flight from A to B, I'm just going to wait until I get to A, and then they turn around and say, well, that flight is now, you know, $2,000, and you know, you originally you could have bought it for 200, but you didn't want to risk it being cancelled. What to do then? So I genuinely really feel for people I know and people I don't know, whose passion is actually exploring the world, and not just you know, going on package holidays for a very predictable experience, which is what most actual holiday making consists of. There really is a difference between a holiday, I think, and traveling in the wider sense. There's been a lot of talk in a lot of travel blogs and articles that I've read about ecotourism, and that was obviously a thing, you know, environmentally friendly tourism as such as it can be, and that was a trend in the industry long before the pandemic came along, or the pandemic response was enacted, and there's much talk about that now in the future. What that essentially boils down to, again, not saying it's a bad thing to preserve habitats and preserve locations. Of course it isn't. The mass tourism causes environmental damage, can do, and has done in the past. But what it essentially boils down to is travel being more expensive, so therefore available to less people. It's as simple as that. And bear in mind that modern tourism, as we think of it, is a relatively recent thing, you know, mass tourism, and it really only got off, in terms of certainly aviation anyway, in the 1950s, and, you know, in the US mainly, and then increasingly in the 60s and 70s and onwards, and it spread around. I mean, even here in the UK, it was unusual for people to fly abroad on holiday very much, you know, right up until, you know, the 1960s and even into the 70s. Most people couldn't afford it. And, you know, staycationing, as we now call it, was still the norm then, as it had been outside of the elites, as it had been since tourism as we know it really, I mean, people have always traveled around the world, but tourism as we know it got underway. It's really more of a, you know, 20th century phenomenon, because the sort of globetrotting that was done in Victorian times, again, that was an elite thing. You know, that wasn't open to the general public. And another thing that plays into this is, from the ecotourism angle, is energy costs and energy availability, because we know that modern jet liners are very thirsty, and there's no way these things are ever going to run on batteries. And with the much talk about the cost of energy, so a lot of that has been spoken about again prior to the pandemic, but when people have been considering the ramifications of the pandemic response, what it means for society, what it means for lifestyles, there's been a lot of talk about energy costs, and we've seen problems with global supply chains also affected by energy. So I don't see any of those energy cost or availability factors playing in favor of mass tourism going forward, or indeed the sort of travel that I spoke about for people that want to explore the world and not just get burnt to a crisp on a beach. Thinking about the energy cost and energy supply angle, once again, the exception to this will be elite echelons in their fleets of private jets who will continue to travel globally, sometimes one or two people with their entourage, and that's all on an entire jet plane. Thinking about the environment, last year in 2021 in Glasgow, we had, of course, the Conference of Parties 26, otherwise known simply as COP26, the big global environmental conference, get together to iron out the world's environmental problems. As usual, that resulted in very little. Delegates who came away from that, who were writing about it in glowing terms, spoke only really, when you look at it, of declarations. Now that's not action, of course, as we know. That tends to be the hallmark of these global initiatives, climate initiatives. Ironically, a lot of hot air. And of course, how did the delegates travel? That many of them travel there in their private jets. And we know Davos, the globalist meeting, annual meeting in Switzerland, is famous for its aerial shots published in the media of dozens of private jets lined up on an airstrip that carried the delegates there. And that speaks to this unwillingness for the people who shout the loudest about climate change and lifestyle to actually make any changes whatsoever to their own lifestyle. It's always everyone else that has to do it. They seem to have factored into the equation that there'll always be some people who don't do this, and it might as well be them. I spoke in the past on videos I made around COVID-19 about the concept in economics of demand destruction. And unlike a lot of economic terms, that's actually does what it says on the tin. It's the destruction of demand. And what we saw in the tourism travel industry was that by making, obviously stands to reason, by making it impossible for people to travel internationally, or extremely difficult, they couldn't. So obviously demand collapsed. That's a given. That's not really through choice. That's forced demand destruction. However, the concern is that a lot of what has been lost won't return. Now, as I mentioned, we've seen as restrictions have eased a little bit, there's enormous appetite for travel. There's a lot of pent-up demand. But with that increase in domestic tourism persisting, my thought is that going forward, it would take, a lot of the airlines have suffered a great deal throughout all of this, and some of them are still struggling to, despite all that pent-up demand, they're struggling to get back to where they were before. It's not just limited to airlines, but they're really the top feeders, I think, in the global travel industry. Most people get around the world on planes, unless you're going on a cruise. And we saw as recently as January this year, 2022, Brussels Airlines, which is a subdivision of the German airline Lufthansa. Brussels Airlines were flying 3,000 empty flights simply to maintain their landing and takeoff slots at Brussels Airport, because it's like if they don't run these flights, then you lose the privilege. You have to keep doing it a certain frequency, otherwise you lose your slots. Expanded out into the wider Lufthansa business, you're looking at 18,000 flights with no one on them. Again, that article was just from January. So that's clearly not sustainable from the company's point of view. And if you're taking it purely from, burning up fuel for no reason, it's an environmental disaster, really. It's one thing to sort of, weigh up the costs and benefits of flying planes crisscrossing all over the world 24/7 full of people. It's another to think about them with like no one on board, simply against, the hope that all of that, the previous activity will return. And I think, you've seen this, this demand destruction, this effort to sort of get people to stop doing things in other areas as well, whether it's driving cars, eating meat. You see that with the big drive for veganism at the minute, which is just showing up in all sorts of places. The media is just full of adverts for like meat substitutes. And so the whole idea is to lifestyle change, basically enforced, but packaged as a choice, as a free choice, and a choice that you want to make. And it's exactly the same with the travel industry, getting people conditioned into a different way of doing things. And my central concern in all of this, it's probably like where all of this ends, is that no matter what happens going forward with any future pandemics, and a lot of people have said, well, if something like this happens again, whatever you think of the severity of it or non-severity of it, whatever you think of the origins of COVID-19, as I've said many times, it doesn't really matter. The issue is the response, what actually happens on the ground. And a lot of people have said, well, we can't respond in the same way. I agree. We shouldn't have responded in the way we did in the first place. However, whether it's warranted or not, the fact remains that mechanisms are in place for governments, local, national, and international organizations, and travel companies, and NGOs, and all sorts of other power structures to simply reimpose restrictions. People can argue against it. They can say it's not justified. They can say whatever they like. There now exists a structure for doing it. And people might, cry and scream and shout hell from the rooftops. But if it says you're in England, for example, and as of midnight tomorrow night, you cannot travel to France for the following reasons, that's it. Doesn't matter what you think about it. That's it. And a lot of the globalists, a lot of the technocrats that were, like the World Economic Forum, for example, who were reveling in the opportunity that the pandemic response presented to them to change our lives profoundly, to change society fundamentally, are not going to give up that easily. And whether anything in their agenda can be pushed forward by the current war, the current conflict, tensions, whatever is actually going on in the Russia-Ukraine border, remains to be seen. But as far as tourism goes, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think one of fundamental drives in all of this, in the World Economic Forum agenda, UN Agenda 21, all of these things, over the last few decades, actually even going back to the Club of Rome in the 70s, 80s and 90s, is to stop people moving around, stop people freely traveling. It's just amazing. There's all sorts of advantages for the authoritarian impulse in keeping people in place, all sorts, and in them getting their experience, their news, whatever it happens to be, their view of the world, remotely, artificially, and mediated increasingly, as we see, by technology. And if you go and look into virtual reality in tourism and the metaverse in tourism, you can see a whole world opening up there, a whole unreal sort of virtual world, which up until now has mainly taken the form of essentially advertising. Have this immersive 3D experience of the Antarctic before you go and consider going on your Antarctic cruise, because it's going to cost you 15,000, and you want to make sure this is something that you want to do, or go somewhere potentially very dangerous in a virtual reality, because you can't travel there at the moment. For example, there's a volcano erupting, but you can go there virtually and look around. Now you're beginning to read, again in travel blogs and articles, people talking about this as the future of tourism and travel. But why, as we've seen so much during the pandemic response, for all these other activities, shopping, sex, all forms of entertainment, and now including travel, why actually go there? You don't need to, that your increasingly advanced headset or whatever the equipment happens to be offers an alternative that's actually even better, apparently. Though quite how you would know that if you hadn't done the real thing, I'm not quite sure. Now for me, again, this is a very unfortunate development. I think the virtual reality is an interesting adjunct to our sensory experience, but I have this just very, very strong feeling, and I've had it myself innately all my life, and I know people who've traveled much, much more than me, and are, it really does define their life. I just think that as creatures, as far back as we can see, modern humans have wanted to explore their environment, to go beyond where they already are, to discover. And once we got beyond basic survival, it's one thing that not all, but most humans have wanted to do, just say, what's over the horizon? Look at these amazing environments that are so unlike our home. We should go there, and I want to experience what it's like with my 5 senses and see the animals that are there and meet the other people. I think it's an innate drive. It's one of the reasons why we're here, in a way, to explore this environment, this green planet, while we're here on it for such a short time, to experience it in a fully immersive sensory way, and fully immersive in the VR, virtual reality sense, is not really immersive at all. I think it's kind of the opposite. It's at best, it's like, I don't know, dreaming about going to the Antarctic or wherever it happens to be. And I think a future where none of us really leave our local environment and we just experience the world as if, online and in virtual reality, as E.M. Forster predicted back in the 1920s in his prescient novel, The Machine Stops. I think that will be a very, very sad way for us to, for our imaginations, and also our minds in general, and our physical bodies, to atrophy as we just sit on a couch somewhere, digitally decaying. I think that would be the worst possible end for our species. So, in the meantime, it'd be excellent if you could subscribe to the channel, the YouTube channel on which you're watching this, probably watching this, Legalize Freedom 1. The more people subscribe, the more widely the videos show up in people's feeds. It's a virtuous circle. There's much more content at the main website, legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where much of it's for free. Also, there's a subscribers area with a lot of extra content available as well. So check that out. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com